to be talking a little bit about what happens besides the stuff that comes with the platform, the operating system. What happens when you design an actual BlackBerry 10 application if you're going to take one that exists on another platform, for instance, and port it over to BlackBerry 10. Do you want to add anything to that? Nope. Okay. So here's how we're going to talk about that. We're going to a little bit about who we are and all that stuff. We're going to show an example concept that we did on Windows 8. We come from a consulting company, Macadamian Technologies, that works with RIM. And we work with other companies. And what we do is when new things are coming out, like BlackBerry 10 or Windows 8, we create what they might look like so we can get ahead of the curve in terms of when they actually hit the ground running. You know, how are we going to deal with this, right? So we're going to show something that we created for Windows 8. It could have been something else. Doesn't matter. The Windows 8 thing's unimportant. The important thing, of course, is the BlackBerry 10 part of it. But we're going to show you an application, what it does, super simple application. We're going to teach you some of the BlackBerry design principles. And then we're going to show you what this Windows 8 application on a tablet might look like on a BlackBerry 10 device, all right? And that's kind of the highlight. When we get there, Martin, we'll give you a bunch of background information, and Martin will show you what it actually looks like, and then we can chat about it at the end.
Okay, so as Scott mentioned, we're going to be taking a Windows 8 application called Talk and move it over to the BB10 platform using Cascades, as well as the design principles put forward by RIM. So we're going to show you some concrete screens as well, showing off the UI design. But take note that these are mock-ups only, okay? No coders were harmed during this process, including myself. So once again, how many developers? 1, 2, okay, so quite a few. I thought about you. I tried to include a few lines of code in here, but I was caught and it wasn't pretty, so I took them out. And now we have some pretty good mock-ups. Also, we have some prizes. So we will be asking a few questions, and if you have the answers, you'll get yourself some prizes.
Some real Canadian maple syrup.
That's right. That's right.
Because we're real Canadians.
Exactly.
There we are.
Voila. So a bit about myself. I've been developing professionally for about 7 years. I started developing with mission-critical systems, mostly C, C++, and OpenGL. And mission-critical systems are interesting because usually you use software that's a little more, I'd say, ancient, a little older, because they have to be either flight-safe or approved by governments. So that was very interesting. But I wanted something a little more dynamic. So I started my own business in web content management consulting. It was very cool, good experience. And then I decided to move along and become a mobile developer consultant. So I had a few contracts there. And then I landed a job at Macadamian Technology. And it's fantastic. I love it. The people are great. And we work with exciting new platforms such as BB10.
So I'll talk about myself very quickly. So I'm the Vice President of User Experience at Macadamian. We're a company about 200 people. Don Lindsay and I worked at the same place, Bell Northern Research in Canada, if anyone knows where that is, about 20 years ago. He left almost right after I joined him. Hopefully, I don't think I drove him out or anything. But he's the VP of User Experience, as you might know from the talk this morning at RIM. And I've been doing this about 20 years and working with designers, developers, business people, and so forth to try and figure out how to bring user experiences to life that people love, just like what RIM's trying to do right now, and I think doing actually an awesome job from what we've seen and from the keynote. Okay, next. Really quick chat about user experience design in general. Just a way of thinking about it that's sometimes useful. When you get a new platform or operating system, it's sometimes useful to go back to kind of the obvious, right? You guys know this, I suspect, but maybe have never thought about this before, quite in this way. When you experience a design, you experience it kind of from the top to the bottom. So you see the visuals first, So then we saw some of the great visuals today in the keynote. And then the next thing you do is you start doing some playing with it, right? So you push on buttons, you do swipes, you do gestures, and so forth. And then eventually you work your way through the information with workflows and navigation and so forth. And so that's how you experience the design. When you build it, when you design it, you actually want to design it in the exact opposite direction, right? So before you even get to the design, you figure out who your users are. They mentioned at the keynote they went and interviewed thousands of users. So that's totally the right way to do a new user experience design. And of course, they also talked to developers and other stakeholders. But they interviewed people to understand what they needed. Then you start to build what's called information design, which you guys know. That's why you build the use cases and information architecture first. Then you start building things like, well, where do all the buttons go and so forth, and then you make it look good visually. So that's how you build a design. Now, that's, whether you're doing BlackBerry or something else, that's always true. That's how you create a great user experience design. What the guidelines do, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is give you some more information on how to do this right. So BlackBerry has put out some guidelines which are evolving, and you can see they're evolving even from the keynote today, that tell you how to create a great user experience design using this methodology and adding in what they do with the guidelines. So if we go to the next slide, this is their guidelines as of a couple of days ago. If you go into that, I mean, you can just search, right, BlackBerry UI guidelines, BlackBerry 10, you'll find them. And there's lots of great information there. So if you're developing apps, you should go take a look at this. It is evolving all the time. There's stuff they talked about today. For instance, the information on peak, right? A few days ago wasn't there. Maybe there today, I don't know. But I think it was because they unveiled it here, right? There's really useful stuff there. And if you look at how the guidelines are structured, right? There's things you want to learn when you're developing an app, and you should know, and then there's things you can just reference, right? If you learn the top stuff, you can tend to look up the bottom stuff, right? So if you learn the design principles, which we're going to tell you a little bit about today, so that'll help you when you develop stuff, that's useful, right? If you learn what's called the UI framework, which is, you know, how do you structure navigation? What's the stuff about sidebars if you don't know it? Action overflows, the grid, right? I don't know. Has anyone looked at the UI guidelines in this room? Okay, yes, you would, of course. Okay, so we've got two people, right? So, I mean, if you're going to be developing apps, you need to be familiar with it. Some people are intimately familiar with it, no doubt, right? But start from the top, learn the framework, right? Learn the patterns. Right? The patterns are how to, you know, you don't want people saving different ways and across different applications, right? So patterns repeat themselves. And then it gets more detailed as you go down. Components, you know, what's a checkbox? How's that work exactly on BlackBerry? Now, one of the great, and then eventually the visuals, right? One of the great things from the keynote that you probably noticed is some of the stuff comes for free, right? In the sense they've built into the operating system and how you code stuff, some of how the behaviors will work, right? And they've got the porting booth, right, which is fantastic, because if you got existing application and you're porting, of course they're going to port in a way that's consistent. So one of the nice things about this is there's a lot of stuff that's already built in, right? When you develop it, it'll give you some of the behaviors, but there's always stuff you need to think about. There's always choices you make as a designer, right? How wide or how deep is information architecture, for instance, right? Then you have to know the bits and pieces of this in order to use them properly, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about it today, and we can, at the end, if you have more specific questions, we can go into how do I deal with this or how do I deal with that? And some of these things, typical in guidelines, there's no one answer for everything. There's more than one way to design any app and still be consistent with the guidelines. And occasionally you'll break them. I saw one today where they broke their own guideline. Not because this is a horrible thing to do, but sometimes there are other considerations. It was the Facebook one. You might have noticed that, right? They broke the guideline. And again, that's why it's a guideline. I don't know if you guys ever So what was it, Pirates of the Caribbean, where he says it's, they're more guidelines than pirate code, right? Occasionally you can, breaking's probably too strong a word, but tweak them, right, or use them in a different way to conform with other expectations users have. Okay. It was the tab. I think they did. They only showed it quickly. So there's this idea that's in the existing ones, anyways, that when you create the information architecture, what you do is you always, when you want to get more information, more navigation to other areas at the highest level of information architecture. So in information architecture, you have basically buckets of information. We'll show you them later. And if you have 4 buckets of information, you can kind of put them down below in what's called the action bar. So at the top level of information architecture. So top levels of information architecture, for instance, are what you see when you get into a web page and you see the 4 or 6 categories you can go to. That's the highest level of information architecture. And what the guidelines say is put the highest level of information architecture in tabs along the bottom. And if you have more than 4, you introduce this, this button that's 3 lines. Right? You guys might have seen that, and it's probably got a name, I don't know what, but it opens up a sidebar, right? And then you have the other layers of information architecture. And they say put it at the bottom, and there's a good reason for putting it at the bottom. There's an ergonomic reason for putting it at the bottom. They talked about, I hold it in one hand, I can get it quickly. It looked like they'd put it up at the top for Facebook, right? Now, it may have been something else, and I showed it really quickly, so I may be wrong, but it looked like they put it up at the top, right? And that may be because they're conforming to some way that Facebook behaves. And you'll often see this. That can be really, that's good design, right? And I'm sure these guys thought about it, whoever designed it. You go, okay, so what's the user's expectation? So there may be an expectation there, right? I may be wrong, they might not have broken it. I only looked at it for a second, but it looked like they did. Any other excellent question? Any other questions, comments? Okay.
Okay, so let's have a quick look at the Windows 8 Talks application. So essentially what it is it's an application that lets you view TED Talk videos on your tablet. So this is the main screen, the highest level in the information architecture. It lets you do 4 principal user goals. The first one is to search a video. Second one is to refine a favorite video, because you want to be able to set videos as your favorite so you can find them again quickly. There's also the find related videos, very useful if you enjoyed a video and you say, oh, well, I want to see what else is related to that, so you can have access to that. Or if there's a video you're watching and you say, oh, that's not exactly what I'm looking for, the related videos can help you. As well as see videos other users like. So other users of the tablet will be marking videos as favorite, and you can see the popularity show up in the application as well. So let's have a look at that. The search functionality is crucial. So we wanted the users to have access to that no matter where they were in the application, whether it's on the main screen or whether it's while they're viewing a video. So on Windows 8, on the tablet, it's a quick right or leftward swipe from the side, and you have access to that search bar. Secondly, the favorite feature. So while you're viewing a video, it's a quick swipe upwards from the bezel. And on the top or the bottom left section, there's a Add to Favorite button. The second that you press that, that video is now listed under the Favorites tab in the main application here. So it makes it easier for the users to go back to it. Next, find related videos. Yep. Absolutely. So one thing that's important to know, it's a good question, is when you add a video to the favorite, we don't want to block the playback. We don't want to block the experience of viewing the video. So it's very important to be subtle. So the second that you select Add to Favorite, the action bar goes back down, and the video is now marked as a favorite for you. But the video keeps playing. Absolutely.
And we'll show you later how that works on BB10 with that exact
That's right.
same thinking behind it.
Next, find related videos. So when you select a video, it starts playing in this fashion. If you want to go full screen, you can do so by double tapping the video. But on the right side, you have access to the related talks. And that's actually a scrolling container, so you can scroll from left to right. Popular talks, viewing what other users have marked as favorites, are listed on the main page on the left side under popular talks, and that's a scrolling container as well. Scott, you want to touch on
Sure.
the design principles?
These are design principles that are talked about in the UI guidelines for applications, right? So any application you build should follow these. The kind of mega principles that they talked about today were platform or operating system or however you want to think about it. The hub and the flow are things that apply across everything, right? Not just applications, but in and between applications. And are things that are a core part of the experience that are built into the overall BlackBerry experience, right? So those are, you can see how they show up in the design principles, but when you hear them talk today, you can see they're talking about things that's really about BlackBerry as a whole, right? This is about if I'm building an application, right? And you'll see the connection between them. Okay, so here's the 7 or 8 principles. So this cinematic experience, remember, I mean, I can't remember which one of them, whether it was Don or somebody else who got up and said, you don't have much screen real estate, but you want people to feel like they have screen real estate and that there's more there. That's the idea of the cinematic experience. And that's why you can pull stuff in and out with gestures, right? That's a really important thing that they talked about, the fact that you can use gestures to access beyond just what's in front of you. And the peak is like the kind of key gesture. Right? Communication at its core as a design principle. They also showed this a bit with, I think it was Foursquare or something else, but the idea that you can integrate, right, communication and collaboration things into your application. People who use BlackBerry, I think they mentioned today, like 80% of the time, they're super sharers, communicators, or something like that, right? So, I message, I text, right? It's still a phone, right? So if you have an application that you can bring in those things rather than make the user go outside your application, it's very powerful for your application. It's more likely to be adopted. Users feel an integrated experience. So that's communication at its core. Content is king is this idea that, you know what, UI in a way doesn't have value except to do something else. In the end, you're trying to get to content, right? So, if I'm looking at pictures, I really just want to see the picture. That's what I'm interested in. That's my content, right? So if I have a whole bunch of navigation and things in the way of the picture and titles even, right, that's in my way. So you want to keep in mind when you design that you want to bring content front and center. They also talk about this idea of Chrome, right, that you don't want too much Chrome. Chrome you can think of as kind of visual noise, right? We don't want to spend too much stuff on visual noise. We want the content. That's what people want, right? The fluid workflow. This is a bit of what he was talking about today. When you read it in the guidelines, it's not just about between applications. So of course, this is within applications as well. So if I'm trying to do a particular task, I want to go through the steps quickly and easily. So I really have to think about how my user's going to use the application and understand what steps and build in some shortcuts, for instance. Right? The efficient ergonomics. This also is about going through an application and using it quickly, efficiently, but it's doing it ergonomically, which essentially means keeping in mind, for instance, that people will hold this thing in portrait mode 99% of the time, right? That my thumb may be one of the main things that I'm going to be navigating with or taking actions with. And so that I got to keep the buttons and so forth that I'm going to use close to me. Right? And so you see that pop up in things like the action bar at the bottom where I take actions and so forth. The visceral performance, this is one maybe you want to chat about. It's really the only one that I'd say is kind of technical in nature. It's not about it's design and technology merging, right? And it's about how reactive it is. And there's even some, how many frames per second? Or?
Yeah, 60. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's actually, there is one point I'm going to touch on later that involves exactly that, to make sure that the performance stays top-notch and that loading time is minimized.
Yeah. So when you create an application, it's great if you're going to create a bunch of these, which we're hoping people do, that you keep these things in mind, including the last one, which is moments of charm, which is that way of saying, can you sneak something in there that's kind of really nice that maybe the user didn't expect, right? Always a tricky thing to do, but completely possible. We think we have an example here. One of the things, it's always tough because once you charm them once, then they expect that, and now you got to come up with something better next time because it's no longer charming, it's just expected, right? So today we're gonna in our application look at least 4 of these things, right, that we looked at. But again, the idea is you should be familiar with these things and have them in the back of the mind when you're developing and designing an application. And it will bring that BlackBerry experience that was talked about today to life if you apply some of these things correctly. All right, so I'll talk about this one because it's so we talked a little bit about information design earlier. So in this Windows 8 application, super simple, right? In the sense that its highest level of the information architecture is just 2 buckets, popular talks, TED Talks, right? So if you're going to translate that to BB10, what do you do, okay? So, oh, we got a laser pointer thing. Look at that. See that stuff in there? Right? That area at the bottom is called the action bar. And it allows you to put the highest level of the information architecture there and or actions, right? So the highest level of the information architecture, although I don't know if we can see it right at the bottom, but it's those 2 things that we talked about. Popular is one bucket. TED Talks is the other bucket. So they show up there at the very first screen, right? And and there's some rules around that. You can only have 4 tabs there at most. So if you have 4 buckets, right? If we had 4 types of talks, you could put them all there. If you had 6 types of talks, you have to do something else, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things, the reason we put this as an example, it's such a fundamental thing about building design. You really have to know what your highest level of information architecture is. By the way, when you do the peaking, right, within an application, as far as I can tell from the examples, and you might be able to add to this, but it looks like, as I drill down, I tried it on a few that already exist, as I drill down, if I peak, I will come back to the highest level of information architecture within the application. So that's something to know, right? So for instance, if I go into my contacts list and pull back, I go to the highest level of information architecture. Now it may be, and they haven't written this up in the guidelines, it may be that I'm actually just going back 1 or 2, or there's a specific thing, right? But it looks like this is, and it would make sense, it's your hub within the application as opposed to the big hub of the entire BlackBerry. It's worth noting what you do if you do have more than 4. There's this button, or you can also use the sliding that they showed today, right? There's this button that gives you access to those other layers. So if I had 6 or 7 types of talks, they pop up in what's called the sidebar, and you saw some examples of that today. But you need to be aware of how to structure the information architecture and how to let people get to different layers. You want to talk about this one? Search from.
Okay, so as we saw here, information architecture, searching from anywhere, very useful. It has to be translated in the UI guidelines of BB10. So in this case, what we have is the search function is on the tab pane at the bottom. And when you toggle it, it shows up your keyboard and your search field. The search function will also be present on the navigation pane when you're viewing a video. Because remember when I said the search function has to be available everywhere on the application? So that's reflected as well. The favorites, as you've seen in the other slides, translate on the navigation pane as well. So when you're viewing a video, that has to be accessible, and that's where it is. So when you select a favorite video, in our case, the star would be filled out, and that would signal to the user that the video is now a favorite.
So we've just so you know, these are all conscious choices we've made in the application, right, on the action bar. So you ask yourself, what actions, and they said this again, I think, during the keynote, what actions are the most prominent, important ones, right? So there's 3 things that are actions, 2 on the actual video, pause it, add it to favorites, right? Another one, that's an action I might want to do, right? And then the back is not an action, it's a navigation, right? And so that action bar allows you to take actions. It also allows you to navigate. And at the highest level, it allows you to move across information architecture. So the action bar is a very important element of the UI, and there's lots of description in it. And you should understand how it's used because it's a really key aspect of the UI design.
On that particular view,
Yeah.
is the action bar always visible, or is it something that happens?
We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what do you think? Give me a guess. Do you think it should always be visible?
I think if you want to pay attention to the video, you don't want all that stuff in there.
Right. So what he said in a different way is content is king. That's one of the design principles. Do you really want to pay attention to all that stuff? I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's useful at some moment in time, and you might want to get it back. But you're right. You want to pay attention to the video. So gave a great example of content is king. You probably don't want that there all the time. There may be cases where you put stuff there, but a lot of times, I think you're right. Content is king. You want that out of the way.
Also, the back button, because that's through the SDK, we haven't gotten to play with it, but is that something that's just provided by?
Yeah, it comes with the navigation pane.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
And it just goes up.
Yes, it goes back one. It's kind of a push pop.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll get to that in a few minutes as well, the whole availability of most of these controls as you're watching the video. You don't necessarily want that all the time. Okay, so related videos. How are we approaching this? Now, I'll be touching in depth on this point later, but what we have some sort of a pull-down tab that lets you have access to that. So when you're viewing a video, you pull down that specific tab, and it shows you the related videos. But we're going to connect that to a moment of charm as well.
So this is something that we'll show you more how it works later, but BB10 allows you to insert things that are a little different as long as you're still conforming to the guidelines. This is one of the things where we've inserted something a little different just to show you guys how it might work and why it might work that way.
Yep. Up next, we have popular talks. As you would expect, as you've seen before, it's part of the top level of the information architecture. It is the first tab. Pretty straightforward. Okay, so now we've looked at the tabs application, the talks application on Windows 8. We've also talked about the design principles on BB10 and translated the concepts. So let's have a look at how this would be, or this could be in practice. So here we have it. You've seen the screen before. This is the top level of the application. On the bottom, we have our famous tab pane, which contains the popular talks, contains the TED Talks, and the search function. And you'll notice that here, there's something missing at the bottom, which would be the favorites tab. And it's not there because we have not marked any videos as favorites yet. Once you do, the tab would show up. The top section is a list view, as we call it in Cascades. Can anybody tell me what's special about this list view? And
So
I think
it's
this
a
is...
grid, they're calling it grid view in the guidelines, actually.
It's a list view with a
Or
grid
view
list
thing,
layout.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Grid list.
That's a tricky question. So that was one of the questions.
Yeah.
The other question is, what's particular about this list view with a grid list layout? It's not just text. Yep. That's right. And to do that, we have to customize our data model. So yeah, that's
All right,
a good
good,
answer.
Bartolomé,
Yeah,
for
that's
that.
So
Our first winner.
congratulations. So to recap, this list view contains a grid list layout and has custom data model. Now, I won't go into detail on how to create your custom data model, but I will point you in the direction of two very good resources that will show you how to do that. The first is the stamp collector sample application. And that application shows you how to lay out your list in a grid list view fashion. It also shows you how to load JSON data from a file, which is very useful. And the other resource is a knowledge base article written by one of my colleagues. He decided to write this article because it's a very common use case. So Stuart wrote this in a very clear fashion. The big picture is you have to extend the data model class in BB Cascades namespace. That's a programming side note. And what you do is you have to overwrite three functions: the has children, the get child, as well as the data function. And the data function is the important one because that's where you customize your cells. Okay, so at that point, you would create your thumbnail, you would create a text overlaid on top, and that's how you'd go about doing it. So when you create your list view, you would set data model to that new class that you've just created. Any questions on this? Yep.
Sorry, so what's the difference between list view with grid view setup and grid view?
It's actually a list view with.
So there's no such thing as
It's a vertical scrolling mechanism.
Can you constrain it some way to make it scroll?
I've never tried horizontal scrolling, but it'd be something to try out. Yeah. There's also another point I want to mention here, and it's that we have our list view with the grid list layout, and it's all nice and swell. But at this point, if we select the TED Talks tab, how many videos do we have? Right? Hundreds. There are hundreds of videos in there. We can't load that all at once, because if we did, that would definitely break the visceral performance design guideline. So we need to figure out an approach to solve that. So one thing we can do is to load them by month. We can say, okay, we're selecting TED, and we load the videos for September, for example. And as we scroll through, dynamically, we can say, okay, we're near the end of the list. Let's load August, and July, and June, and so on and so forth. And as we go through, we can also remove some of the earliest videos. So that dynamic approach would keep the application running smoothly, which is very, very important.
Is the infinite scroll built with BOS, like just being able to dynamically call whatever you're
Well, if you want to populate your list view, you still have to implement that in the back end and fetch the information from the server. Yeah. Sorry? You need to clear the earlier nodes. Yeah, so let's say that you're in July, moving in June in the past, then you might want to clear out September, because otherwise you'd scroll in and you'd have too many items in your list. Memory issue, absolutely. Yeah, so you want to control that. Okay, so anyone else? Okay, so we have our main screen, and let's assume that we actually want to view a video. So using the touch motion, we select a thumbnail in the list view. And what happens? Navigation pane slides over. Okay? And at that point, the video loads and starts playing. Now, we've talked about this earlier. Content is king, and that's very important. Even if we are watching the video in portrait mode, chances are you want to focus on the video. That's the main content. That's the center point of the application. So we want these other controls to leave the space. to fade away. We don't want them to instantly disappear because that would be clunky. It would feel odd. So we want to use something smooth to make those things disappear. How do we do that? Actually, that's another Maple question. How do we make controls disappear smoothly in Cascades? Yeah. So how do we do that, technically? There's a really easy way. Anyone? No? It is. It's a Cascade object. We use
That's close enough.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Absolutely.
Hey, Maple syrup, there
Yeah.
you go.
We use implicit animations. And implicit animations are excellent because they control the way things move on the screen. If you want to move something, whether it's scaling, whether it's translating, rotating, or changing the opacity of a visual node of a control, you can associate it with an implicit animation. The implicit animation doesn't let you control how fast the change is made. So it's standardized throughout your Cascade application, which is great. So technically, the way it works is you create an implicit animation object, and you use the static builder function called create, and it takes a visual node and parameter. So it could be any one of these controls, whether it's a text box or a slider. So we would create implicit animations for that. And when you change the opacity, obviously, it happens automatically for you.
So we have 20 minutes left and 3 maple syrup bottles to go away still. So
All right.
keep going.
Get rocking. So here we go. Portrait mode, full screen. Now, obviously, if you use other applications, you probably want to have your video playing in landscape mode. So you tilt the device, and you have your video taking the entire real estate. At this point, if you touch the screen, we don't want to add all the controls on there. So what we add is simply the slider. Because if you're in landscape, that's probably all you want to do. If you want to read the description, you put it back in portrait mode. Now, that's an example. When we touch the screen, the controls fade in using, once again, implicit animations. The description of the video is obviously a scrollable text field. Okay, so we talked about this earlier. When you select a video as a favorite, there has to be some sort of feedback, but it can't be interrupting the experience. So we fill in the star, and that's how we indicate to the user that the video is now a favorite. Now, if we go back before finishing the video, we're returned to the main screen, and we have our favorites tab right now. Moving forward, search function. If you've seen it before, pulls up the keyboard, you start typing, you press enter, the search is performed. If you select a video, it starts playing it as we've seen, but if you touch any area that isn't a thumbnail, that would close the search control. Now let's say we let a video play until the end. Well, we get this screen. So when you saw earlier the video playing, it's actually two controls. There's two overlays. You have the foreign window playing the video, and you have another opaque container containing two options. And I really like this screen, and I'll tell you why. The replay and the related videos are options. They're not features. The features are already there. So replay does two things. It replays the video for one, and the second thing is, on this screen, can anybody tell me what changes when you click replay? Yep. Nope. The play button changes to a pause button because it's playing.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, you get all your controls back and the video is playing, and that play button changes to the pause button. So the system shows you that if you press replay, it's the same thing as if you press play. Okay. Now the related video is interesting because we've seen how to access it with the tab on top, but if you press this button, the system will bring down the tab for you and show you. Kind of like, let me Google this for you, right? It takes your hand and says, this is how you do it, right? And you have access to your related videos. So we see this as a moment of charm where the system is showing you how to use it. Pulls it down for you. Sorry? Yeah.
Yeah.
If you, the
It's
question
like it
is,
dropped in front.
the
of it.
question is if you move back up that tab, you'll be returned to the same page as before. Yes.
So is that a out-of-the-box UI element related to?
The question is that an out-of-the-box UI element? It is not. It would have to be custom. Yeah. Okay, so that's the application in a nutshell.
So maybe we can just, we'll review a couple of things we talked about and a few things we didn't talk about, right? So we didn't talk about a ton of stuff because it's hard to take in everything in one unless you're really familiar with all the guidelines. But we talked about a lot about how you use this action bar, right? And because it's super important, it's one of the first places you start the information architecture, right? The high-level information architecture has to go there, and your key actions go there. It's available to do things that are important to the user, right? They also have, which we didn't show, the sidebar, which you access with those 3 dashed lines that allow you to get more information architecture. And there's also, you may have seen, I saw it in one of the applications today, 3 dots. And that's how you access additional actions. So if you could, there's more stuff you could potentially do with this video, right? Send it to a friend or something like that, right? If you wanted to, potentially. Right, so if you start to think about, I need to add more actions, these 3 dots, and it brings in the action overflow menu, which they had a few examples today, and then there's a bunch of extra things there. So again, the idea is that I can get at that stuff if I need it, but it's not in my face, right? That was the design thinking behind it.
About the action bar.
Sure.
Seems like there's a visual difference between the search and the actual pages that people go through. Looks like there's search is an action. You don't have the little tab on top.
So you'll notice, and to be honest, I don't remember all the exact details, but you do typically, when you create a UI, you want to differentiate actions from navigation. So an obvious one is the back button, right? You can see how they put that line in between it, right? And there are definitely, there's a visual style actually talk right after this one. But when you have different objects, you absolutely want to show, oh, there's something different about them. You also want to show things like, well, you've selected this or not selected that, right? Just like the favorites, you light that up somehow, show it's selected. And there are absolutely rules in there for how you activate buttons and what the visual colors are. So the question just for everybody is, hey, how come search looked like that, right? And that's generally true for all objects in a UI, right? If there's something different about them, either their state or the nature of the object, you make them look different. And there are rules around that they've put in the guidelines.
Are those attributes just something you put, in part of your call, so you just search and you can give it some kind of label that the SDK knows to do it differently, or is this custom of the action bar that Macadamian?
I'd have to look into that. I'm not exactly sure how to bring up this distinction. But,
So you get maple
definitely,
syrup for stumping.
Absolutely. It's a very good maple-worthy question.
Stump the presenter, you get a maple syrup.
Yeah.
All right.
And
Great questions.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the API is changing. They're always introducing new things. So it's very important to go on there and see what's new at every iteration. Yeah. But it's exciting because there's a lot of good stuff in there. Yeah. Yes?
So the question is, what's the maximum number of buttons on? No, so the maximum on the action bar is 4, right? And then if you're beyond that, you can, if it's navigation, you call it with the, and I can't remember the name, but you call it with the 3 dashed lines, and that comes in from what's called the sidebar lives over here and comes in. And if you have more actions, they live over there. So you can call them, right? But
Yeah.
it's a conscious design.
It's automatic. The
Thing
second you
too,
can
right?
add 1, 2, 3, 4,
Yeah.
5, whoop, then you have that access.
Yeah. And if you have actions, and they call it the action overflow, which makes sense. If you have those actions, the most important ones go at the top, and the least important ones at the bottom. So we have 10 minutes. We have to think of ways to give away two.
One thing I want to mention is that if you're developing your applications, go online, go on the community forums. People are very active on there. I've been observing it for several months, and there's a lot of positive energy. People are helping each other. It's very constructive. These sample applications are very good. They give you a very broad overview of how to use most controls and patterns. Knowledge base articles as well, very useful. If there's a specific way to use certain controls, that's what the knowledge base articles are there for. So if you say, oh, I really want to do this with my list view, chances are someone's thought about that before and created a article. So there's some about using sensors, incorporating OpenGL in a foreign window, customizing your data model, very useful stuff on there.
And for the non-technical things, for the actual UI guidelines, they're updating them all the time. Right, so it may be that I mean, if you have a question about it, that question's been answered. What do you do if I have more than 4? Right? They have the action overflow, but I'm sure there's other questions that are going to come up. That only
Just
has
for an
one.
extra one.
So what'll happen is if you have 5, you'll bring up 2, right? Because you'll end up having ... right?
That's
and
right,
so it
which
doesn't
takes
look
some
as
space.
But I understand, and there's always those trade-offs in UI. Interestingly, what they call the application bar, which you can bring in from the top, which has logout and help and so forth that sometimes you make available depending on the application, it has 5, and you can bring it in from the top. And the reason, I suspect, although it doesn't say this, the reason it has 5 versus 4 is you really want to make sure people hit those actions correctly, right? So you want to give them a nice big target. There's room for mistake, right? There's room for getting your parallax off or doing it in a hurry, right? So those are nice big buttons, which I think is a good idea. If I'm just doing something once in a while like help, it's not as necessary, and so you know what, I can be a little pickier. What's that?
Sorry?
Oh, okay, well this is, no, it's okay, but thanks. We're close to the end. So how about, here, we'll try and give away one of these with first person who can name 3 design principles.
Oh, that's a good one.
Anyone? 2? Can you sure? I just said name it, I didn't give you restrictions.
Using notes, okay.
Okay, can you explain one of them?
Ooh.
Sure.
Yeah.
Communication at its core, it sounds the same as Windows 8, where you show the information and you don't fill it up with lots of navigation and that kind of stuff.
So I'd say that's the content. So great explanation. I'd say that's what they meant with the content is king. But that's okay. So that was a great, you're right. It's about not filling it up with UI elements. Content is king. There's your maple syrup. It's about giving me what I really want, which is the content.
I had a question. I'm currently using WebWorks. Are we getting away from WebWorks for Cascade? Is that the general idea, or are they the same thing?
No, they're different. You can use, when you're building in WebWorks, it's essentially HTML5, right? So you'd be developing for that. I like using cascades. I'm more comfortable with the C++ and QML directly. So, yep. You mean like Adobe Air, Java runtime, and I would not think so. I'd have to confirm, but no, you're selecting your development environment. I tend to stick to one of them. But okay, thank you.
Do they have the equivalent of like sticking a web view into a native application?
Yes, you can. Yeah, absolutely.
So just to repeat, the question was?
Is there a way to introduce some sort of a web view in a native application? And yes. Well, at that point, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any gesture controls within this particular application? So can you use gesture controls within an application, or is that all just OS stuff?
No, inside your application, what you do is you subscribe to events, right? You say it's a signal slot thing. So you on touch move, on touch up, on touch down, and you subscribe to these events at the application level, and then you can work from there. And depending on how you build your application, you have containers overlapping other containers. You can have containers catching the touch event and propagating, if you want, to other layers. But you have to control that.
How do you, sorry, this is a nice question.
Yeah.
How do you do all, since there's no home button and all that stuff, how do you,
Go back to the OS.
yeah, multicast?
Well, there's a lot of gestures that come with the OS, and that was presented this morning. For example, the upward swipe on the device will minimize your application. There's the new peak feature, which is upward and side. So that's it kind of overrules your application.
So the question, that was a really good
Yeah.
question around how do you get to the home, which they're calling the hub, right? And there is a combination of things you can do, and you saw them do it today, which I thought was very cool, right? Where you start to drag up, and then it revealed upon the left the inbox and how many email I got, and then I can reverse it. Remember how they talked about the fact, if I'm pulling it up to show you more stuff, reversing it should reverse it, right? It's pretty natural, right? If I keep pulling it up, it actually minimizes the application, right? And allows me into the hub, right? And it's kind of halfway in between when it reveals the inline stuff. So I think that's a very cool thing that they've done in terms of the design. And they pushed it, how interesting and innovative it was, I think, justifiably, because I think they've really solved a tough problem, how to get home with hardly any real estate, right? And make it simple. That's it. We're at 3:13. But we have one bottle of
more
maple
unit
syrup
to give
yet.
away.
So we have to think of something to give it away. So how about someone tell me something interesting they learned at the keynote today? I'll give you a bottle of maple syrup if you didn't get one. Come on.
There are countless interesting things we learned at the keynote today.
Someone tell me how peak works. Someone, okay?
Drag it up and then drag it left.
Yeah, you drag it off to the side. Yeah,
To left
drag
or
it
right?
up to the, there you
On
go.
the side. Okay. Is it up? It's up and then on the right.
Up and to the, depending on what you want to do, right? The peaking is actually pulling, right? The sliding up gets me to the hub, but when I'm peaking, I'm sliding over like that. And you can do the hub is interesting. Like if I go to the hub, I can do that and then pull over, right? And then you can peek within an application. If you go into something like contacts, you can actually peek behind. So that earned you a maple syrup. You're welcome. Yep.
Is there any integration with the particular Talks application to share videos, or is it just not?
So this is a theoretical application,
Yeah.
right? So the communication at its core is definitely the idea that you look for places to share, right? And I don't know technically how hard that would be and what the use case would be, but absolutely, you want to think about stuff like that. Yeah.
I just recently started developing BlackBerry and started with the playbook. If you had a choice, would you choose Facebook or BBM, or would you put in both for sharing? Do people use people use BBM? Do they not use Facebook, or is this an additional way to acquire consumers?
So
would
we
target
know,
both.
they're both hugely popular, right? BBM, and I think that's why they, I mean, if you looked at, was it Foursquare that had them
They
both
introduced the BBM on the side.
introduced, right? I mean, that which is ultimately a business user question, right? But they're both hugely popular. I mean, you know, one, of course, we know about Facebook, and they were talking about BVM actually made it as a word into Webster. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that speaks to the popularity of both. So it's a,
Is that something that comes through in commercials in Canada, or in pop culture that BBM is a thing on Facebook this year?
I don't know. In Canada, certainly BBM is, you know, well known, and there's definitely, I mean, the BlackBerry community, right? And they talk about their BlackBerry users and their profiles and so forth. And they, what was it, 60, 80 million users worldwide, right?
80.
And I mean, BBM's core for that. And I think it's Canada, of course. It's popular, but I mean, they also talked about worldwide, how many places. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, is that right?
And so the comments were it was popular in Thailand, Indonesia, South Africa, right? So there's you know, depending on your market, of course, that can make a difference, right? But there's tons of opportunity to incorporate it, obviously, and that's why it was demoed, and that's why I think it relates to that communication at its core design principle.
Okay, so, oh, sorry.
I think
Yes,
you can.
they'll
yeah, you
make it
can get-
available.
They're going to make all these available.
The
Yeah.
slides and the audio as well.
Yeah. And we have cards up here. They're all Martin's cards. So if you know have technical questions, you can email them and say, "Hey, I was at your talk. I thought about this, and can you help me out?"
Yeah, I will respond. And one
Yeah.
last note, join us at the roundtable for the session at 6 p.m. tonight, Exhibition Hall 1. Sit down, have a chat. We can talk more in depth technically if you like.
Yeah. So if you think of some questions, right, come back at 6. We'll hang out there for a while, and we can chat for 15, 20 minutes and about that. Thanks so much for coming out.
Yeah, thank you.
And maybe we'll see you guys around. Enjoy your maple syrup if you got some. We're sorry if you didn't get any.
Thanks.